Good afternoon and welcome to our webinar today. I'm Glenda Cleasy, Agronomy Specialist with Saskatchewan Pulse Growers, and with me today is Andrea Lauder, Communications Manager, also with Saskatchewan Pulse Growers. So thank you again for joining our third webinar in the 2017 Pulse webinar series. We have one more webinar scheduled for October on the basics of grading your pulses. This webinar can be found on the SPG website under the News and Events tab. As a reminder, CCA and CCSC credits are available for today's webinar. To get these credits, you must be watching it live. For those who attended the webinar, Andrea will send out an email after the webinar requesting your CCA numbers. If more than one person is watching from one computer, you will need someone to verify those in attendance. Once verified, you can include all CCA numbers in one email. If you miss sending in your CCA number, you can always self-report. This webinar will be recorded and will be posted to the SPG website for future viewing for those who are unable to attend or for those of you who would like to look back at the material that was covered. Recordings will be posted to the SPG website under the Communications tab. For today's webinar, all of the participants will be muted, but we would be happy to take your questions. If you would like to ask a question, please type it into the question box located on your GoToWebinar dashboard. You can type and send your questions in at any time throughout the webinar. We will be holding questions primarily until the end of the webinar. Today, we are pleased to have a team of speakers giving the webinar. All of the speakers today are regional crop specialists with the Saskatchewan Ministry of Agriculture, and they're going to be speaking today on scouting for pulse diseases and soybean diseases. Sherry Roberts is one of the speakers. She's a regional crop specialist based out of the Weyburn office. Sherry graduated from the University of Minnesota with a BSc in agricultural education with a minor in agriculture engineering. She has extensive work experience in the horticultural industry as well as teaching high school and vocational agriculture. Sherry has a special interest in designing online learning and management tools to help producers with decision making and improving their bottom line. Sherry works with producers and industry to help solve crop production problems and identify relevant applied research opportunities. John Ippolito will be our second speaker, and he is a regional crop specialist based out of the Kindersley office. John has a BSc in agriculture from the University of Saskatchewan. He has worked in agriculture extension with the focus on crop production and farm management since 1987. His main areas of focus are crop production with specialization in pulse crops and precision agriculture. And Kim Stonehouse will be our final presenter. He's a regional crop specialist based out of the Tisdale office. Kim holds a BSc in agriculture, an MSc in agricultural and bioresource engineering, and an MSc in environmental engineering. Before joining the Ministry of Agriculture, he conducted agricultural research for the East Central Research Foundation in Kenora. Kim works with producers to solve crop production problems, identify applied research opportunities, and assist producers in adopting new crop production technology to make their farms and businesses more profitable. And with that, I will now turn the presentation over to Sherry to start off our webinar.
Thank you very much, Glenda. Andrea, my colleagues and I are very happy to be here today, so we'll get things rolling so we can cover as much material as possible. Today I'm going to talk to you about scouting for soybean diseases, and as Glenda's already covered the intro, we'll skip over that one. And the first thing, as we all know, before you can have any kind of a disease, there's a disease cycle that has to happen. You have to have the proper environment for that disease to occur. You have to have the disease-causing agent, and you have to have the susceptible host. I believe some people have not quite grasped this concept that all three of these need to be present in order for a disease to happen. For instance, if you have Fusarium in a field and you have a susceptible durum or wheat variety, but yet you don't have rain at the time that the flowering is occurring, your chances of a disease taking hold and really getting going are a whole lot less than if you have an environment that's cool and wet and raining at the time that the flowering is occurring. So first thing when you're thinking about scouting is, what kind, am I meeting that three basic needs on the disease triangle? Is there even a need to go out and scout? Have these things happened? Have they occurred? Now, every disease has a different time frame for when it's going to occur. For soybeans, for instance, if you want to go out and scout for seedling diseases, you're going to want to, of course, be looking in May and June. If you're looking for Phytophthora, which They're doing a lot of work in Manitoba. We are doing some studies here in Saskatchewan, but as of yet, I have not heard any confirmed cases of Phytophthora here. But if you want to look for it, you're going to want to go out and look in May, June, July, and August. Rhizoctonia root or stem rot, let's go look for in May or June for sickly looking plants. If we're talking white mold / Sclerotinia, the time to go out and look for that would be July and August. Pod or stem diseases would also be August or September. And if you're looking for brown stem rot, once again, August or September. There's no sense going out and looking for a disease that's not going to have materialized yet in the time frame. So once again, when you're going scouting, look at your calendar, ask yourself, okay, we are now into June. What might be starting to appear in the fields, and work from there. Next, we also realize, as we said with the disease triangle, that there are favorable temperature and environments for different diseases to occur. Now, when we're talking soybeans, they are susceptible to a various variety of different root rot diseases. So are some of the other pulses. And as people that have been in this province for any length of time, now that we've been in a wet cycle, know we've had a surge in these different root rot diseases. For instance, we have the Fusarium complex, and that has a wide soil temperature range. And it can also occur whether the soil is wet or dry. It has some connection, possibly maybe with soybean cyst nematode, but up here we have not yet found any soybean cyst nematodes, as soybeans are such a new crop to the province. We can cross our fingers and hope we never have to deal with that one. And Fusarium complex is also somewhat of a management issue when you're going to scout. And one of the first things you should be asking your producers is, what kind of rotations have you been doing, and how tight have these rotations been? The tighter the rotations are, and unfortunately some producers are still into extremely tight rotations, your diseases are going to be a lot more common, and you're going to be out there finding them in just about every other field here and there. So get your history, find out how tight these rotations have been, and then start looking. Am I in the proper environment? Now, if you're going to go out and scout for Rhizoctonia, you want to do that when the soil temperatures are warm and the soil moisture is moist. As you know, this year so far in this part of the province, we haven't had much of a moisture issue, so Rhizoctonia probably isn't going to be that common. But yet, if you go up to Kim's area up in the northeast, where rain has been their best friend this spring, and into the early summer, you're probably going to see a lot more Rhizoctonia happening. Pythium rot, once again, likes a cool soil temperature, and also you have to have moisture. Same with Phytophthora. If you don't have these factors, if they aren't present, once again, your chances of being able to go out and look for the diseases and actually find them in the fields becomes minimal. First off, we're going to talk about Fusarium. I've heard a lot of producers say, well, they've gone into, for instance, corn or some of the other crops or soybeans because they don't have to deal with Fusarium. Soybeans are susceptible to Fusarium, and this slide certainly shows you we have Fusarium acumanatum, Fusarium oxysporum, and Fusarium aviaceum. And look at the roots. You can see very few feeder roots. You see the brown discolorations. You see the lack of nodulation. These are all issues that you can see if you dig up the roots when you start seeing some plants that look rather sickly. So bring a good shovel with you and a bucket of water so you can rinse these roots off. This is a study that's been being done by Dr. Deb McLaren over at the Ag Canada at the Brandon Station in Manitoba. She's done extensive work for the last couple of years with Fusarium, and it definitely is an issue. And once again, look at rotations. Was the field perhaps in wheat last year, and that wheat had a Fusarium issue, and they didn't use a seed treatment this spring? Could be one of the reasons why you're seeing seedling root rot issues. Next, Rhizoctonia root rot. It occurs not only just when the plants are little, but as you can see here from the photographs, that the plants are fairly good size. We've already got into our trifoliate leaves. It can hit, and the Rhizoctonia root rot complex pathogens can infect the seed, the hypocotyls, and the roots. So when you go out to the field to look, you'll look for plants that often die in groups, and then you want to go look for this reddish brown color is also another diagnostic symptom to look for. And once again, have we had the proper environment to stimulate the Rhizoctonia disease? Once again, remember, warm, moist soil. Factors that increase your risk of Rhizoctonia, as it says, moderately wet soil, 30 to 60% water holding capacity, warm soil, greater than 24 degrees centigrade, and as someone from the United States, I'm still in the Fahrenheit, so that's 75 degrees Fahrenheit. Late planting dates also favor Rhizoctonia root rot. Phosphorus and potassium deficiency and a soil pH greater than 6.6, so you get to be a crop detective while you're out there. Physical damage and stress to soybean plants is also another factor. High amounts of crop residue. So if you see any of those, start thinking Rhizoctonia. And once again, of course, a majority of the root rot complexes will need to have a lab to tell you exactly what species you're dealing with. You'll want to take them into either the crop diagnostic lab that the province has or some of the other private labs and have that kind of work done so that you know the exact strain and species that you're dealing with. Now, a disease in soybeans that I saw a lot of last year and the year before is bacterial blight. Once again, this disease is caused up by a bacteria, so there's not a whole lot you can do about it once it's shown up. There's not much preventative out there, but it's good to know what's causing the disease. I know a lot of people, when it first started to show up here in the soybean crops, they said, oh, well, that's hail damage. It does look a lot like hail damage. How do you tell the difference? Look for the little yellow halo. You'll see that you will not find that little yellow halo with hail damage. That occurs with bacterial blight. Normally, it doesn't create that huge of a loss. It generally comes later on in the season, July or August. It can do some major damage, however, in irrigated fields if you have a real tight canopy. So once again, watch for percentage of damage in leaf, but there's not really anything you can do. As I said, it's caused by a bacteria. Here in Canada, we have no bactericides to fight this disease. Next one you're going to find out as you walk around, and there's been quite a bit of this the last 3 years that I've been out scouting soybeans, is Septoria glycines or brown spot. With this, your spots appear on the unifoliate leaves after the trifoliate leaves have appeared. So if you go out scouting too early, these are your unifoliate leaves down here, of course, you'll start seeing, and then gradually over time, if the environment is right, it will move up the plant. But as they found, it does not cause real severe damage unless it comes real early in the season, and we haven't been seeing that. Now, your spots may or may not have a yellow halo around them, so don't necessarily say, oh, that's going to be my big telltale sign. Other disease symptoms, understand they occur on the lower leaves of the soybean plant, and they progress upward as the plant develops. Now, why do I stress that? Because some people oftentimes confuse this with herbicide damage. And generally, if you see herbicide damage, you're going to see it on the older leaves. It's going to be at the top of the plant moving downward. So with brown spot, starts at the bottom, moves up. Last but not least, on the real biggies that we have here and have an issue with, white mold, or as oftentimes some people may or may not realize, this is Sclerotinia that you find in canola. I do know some producers are not aware that it is the same disease, is caused by the same disease-causing organism. And the biggest thing that you'll want to be aware of on this one when you go out to scout is what has been the crop rotation. As you know, Sclerotinia can generally hang around a field for at least 2 years. So if you know the previous year the field was in canola and you start seeing some odd symptoms, I'd start thinking right off the bat white mold, particularly if you've had a moist season and if your canopy's nice and thick. Start walking. We found a lot of this last year out and about, and a lot of people had never seen it before and they did not understand what it was. And you will see exactly these nice white little, I guess, cottony type growths on the stems. And you look at the other picture over there, you pull your stem up and you can see it. It will start at the bottom and it works its way up the plant. If you were to split the stem open, you're going to find the sclerotia inside the stem, just like you would in canola, and you'll see the shredding of the stem. And if you're uncertain, is this really a sclerotia or not, the key is snap them open or cut them open, and if they're white inside, that's your big indicator of that you're dealing with a sclerotia body. And once again, there's a favorable environment for white mold that you need to be on the alert for. Is there high moisture during the flowering stages? This is going to give you a big key indicator whether you're going to have to go out. Or is there cool temperatures during and after flowering? So cool, moist conditions, just like some of the root rots. Have you got high plant populations? Why? Because that reduces the airflow through the field and keeps the damp moisture present down into the lower parts of the plant so the disease triangle can get started. Is there an issue with high fertility, especially manure? Oftentimes when you have high levels of nitrogen that have been added, some people do that with their soybeans, although studies have proven there's not a whole lot of benefit of adding more than 20 pounds of nitrogen at the very start, because then your plants won't fix. But if you have that high fertility, it gives you a whole lot lusher, greener growth, more susceptible to disease. And ask what the crop rotation's been. If you're less than 3 years out of soybean or other susceptible crops, and this is where I throw in canola or sunflower. There's not just Sclerotinia in canola or soybeans. You're also going to see it in sunflowers. Excuse me. And does this field have a history of white mold? And as you walk around, what are the weed populations in the field? Oftentimes, people forget that not only are crops hosts for diseases, but weeds also are hosts for diseases. And when it comes to Sclerotinia, look to see, is there a high population of stinkweed, sow thistles, Canada thistle, white mustard, red root pigweed, knapweeds, dandelions, or lamb's quarters? Not only on the headlands, but around the edges of the field into the ditch. Look around, because they can be your host plants for keeping this disease cycle going. Last but not least, Phytophthora, as I stated, we've been doing studies now. This will be the second year in Saskatchewan, thanks to Dr. Deb McLaren out of Brandon at Ag Canada. Phytophthora is present in Manitoba, and they're fearing that it is present here in Saskatchewan. Maybe we just haven't found it. So if you think you have plants that look like this, please get in touch with Sask Post Growers so we can have somebody come out and take some samples of the field and get them sent in. If you're walking and see something that looks suspicious, you're going to start to see a yellowing at the top of the plant, and it's going to form a little shepherd's type hook. And then if you pull up your plant and look at it, you're going to see a canker starting to develop. And this canker usually starts at the soil surface and moves up. So look to see if the canker's present, look for the yellowing leaves, and there'll be a hook. As I said, just like a little shepherd's hook. You can find one dead plant and the next one's next to it can look perfectly healthy, but they can have the disease. They're just not showing symptoms yet. So, as I stated before, they are doing a study. If you do find suspicious plants, please give Post Growers a call, give Glenda a jingle, and depending on where the plants are, either her and I can come out and take a look and get some samples. Now, before we conclude soybean diseases, I would like to say if anybody is interested in learning more about soybean diseases and how you diagnose them, we are actually going to have a soybean field day August 17th at Outlook. In the first part of the day, we're going to talk about just general soybean agronomy, and in the afternoon, we're going to board a bus and we're going to drive around and look at fields. We will have Dr. Dean Malvik, the soybean pathologist specialist at the University of Minnesota, is going to be our pathologist that we'll be working with that day. So if anybody's interested, give a jingle to the Weyburn office and we'll set you up on a registration. Also, if you're interested in soybeans and learning more about the work that Dr. Deb McLaren's done with Fusarium and with Phytophthora, she's going to be our keynote speaker at the Soybean Summit November 15th in Regina at the Wascana Country Club. So since soybean acreage are going to do nothing but balloon in this province, anybody that's interested in finding out more, you have some educational opportunities. And now we're going to turn to scouting for pea, chickpea, and lentil diseases. John?
Thank you, Sherry. Yep, John Ippolito here from Kindersley. I'm going to quickly go through a bunch of diseases, peas, lentils, and chickpeas. Mycospirella is probably one that most growers and agronomists would be common with. Characteristic small purple spots with irregular margins on the leaves. On the stems, you get a similar lesion Although you may also get what's known as foot rot, which is a lesion on the lower part of the stem that is actually caused by a different fungus, but it's considered to be part of what's called the Ascochyta complex. And then, of course, later in the season, you could get similar colored pods, lesions on the pods. It's a stubble-borne disease. So rotation's important, but the other thing to keep in mind with this stubble-borne disease is the fact that it can, in the early part of the growing season, the ascospores can move significant distances by wind. So, you know, even what's happening in adjacent fields in the past can have some impact on what happens with Mycosphaerella and Ascochyta foot rot in peas. I think we'll skip to the next one there then, Sherry. Ascochyta pisi is not a common disease in Saskatchewan, but I guess why I'd kind of bring it to people's attention is it is one that we have seen in surveys in the southwest part of the province in the past. Characteristic stems and leaf lesions are kind of tan colored with a darker margin, not a whole bunch different than what you would see in terms of an Ascochyta lesion on a lentil or a chickpea. Again, not a common one, but particularly in the southwest, you may encounter it. To be honest, we don't have a good explanation as to why it's occurring there, but we have seen it in surveys in the past. So in terms of scouting and fungicide application, I guess our recommendation is to, you know, start scouting during the vegetative stages. Early flowering for sure. Now, you know, being in a bunch of fields last week with peas, at the 6-node stage, kind of no evidence of disease at this point in time, but I think part of that is, you know, as Sherry had indicated, part of that's been the environment up until this point in time. With not a lot of moisture, we haven't seen a lot of disease development. Kind of the general rule of thumb in terms of applying a fungicide is it's warranted if 50% of the bottom third of the crop canopy is showing symptoms. The other one to indicate whether you're at high risk is whether you actually are experiencing high humidities such that, you know, the crop canopy is still wet into the mid-morning. So that will give you some indicator. But for sure, you would be looking for symptoms of Mycosphaerella prior to spraying. We probably wouldn't think it's advantageous to do a preventative spray in the case of fungicides on peas. Ascochyta of lentil. This used to be the common disease in lentil. Thanks to advancements in genetic resistance in the breeding, not seen near as often as it was at one time. Characteristic lesions you're looking for are gray to tan lesions on the leaflets. Can also be seen on the pods, but they'll have a dark margin and what are known as pycnidia, or small little black fruiting bodies within the center of the lesions. The lesions, of course, are going to appear first on the lower leaflets, and then with rain splash events could be on stems and pods as they develop. Again, residue-borne disease. So, you know, adjacent fields are even critical. Anthracnose has definitely become the most common disease in lentil in the last number of years. The initial lesions on the lower leaves are white to gray colored without a distinct margin. Most often what we're associating with anthracnose is the lesions on the stems, where we get a sunken portion to the stem, and lots of blackening that is occurring because of the development of fruiting bodies known as microsclerotia that will develop into those stems. With severe stem infection, we get leaf drop, and, you know, it'll spread from plant to plant to the point that eventually you'll see a yellow spot in the field, and at harvest you'll actually see patches in the field that have black stubble. mainly because of the darkening of the stems from the lesions. Again, residue-borne disease and very little relationship to seed in the case of anthracnose. So when we're scouting for these, we would scout for the two of them together. Start scouting at the 8 to 10 node stage, which is after the herbicides have been applied, but prior to the flowering. Because of the association with infected residue, quite often field margins against last year's lentil crop or even the previous year's lentil crop, are going to be the high infection areas. So because of that, you may want to use somewhat of an M pattern within the field, look at a number of locations, just to determine, is this only an edge impact or is it occurring across the entire field? For all the diseases, one of the neat things we can do now is flag a couple of spots, take a picture with the smartphone and go back to the same spot a week later or however many days you wish, and see whether you're seeing any more development or no development. So that's something to keep in mind. If there we go. If you truly want to try and determine, is it anthracnose versus Ascochyta, you will need a magnifier to have a look at those pycnidia and or microsclerotia. The microsclerotia are more irregular in shape and quite often clustered together more. But anthracnose for sure is more likely to be seen as a stem disease as opposed to a leaf disease. Optimum timing for the fungicide application would be, as the first flowers emerge. May be required again later, but for sure that would be the first time that you would want to do it. This table is a fungicide support system developed for lentils that's actually in the Sask Pulse Growers lentil production guide. Combines a number of factors together to help you make a decision whether you're at risk or not and whether a fungicide is recommended. So it's another tool you can use when you're trying to figure out, do I need to be applying a fungicide? Okay, Stemphylium is a common disease we see in lentils. It's actually a naturally occurring pathogen that's in the ground. It doesn't have very distinct symptoms. The initial symptoms are just small beige lesions on leaflets, no margins or pycnidia. They eventually coalesce to get to the point where the entire leaf is this tan color that you see here. And often the entire crop canopy will have a tan color because the Stemphylium has impacted all of the leaves up in the top of the canopy. Currently, we don't consider it to be significant in terms of yield loss, so would never recommend controls specific for Stemphylium. You may get some benefit from the fungicide application for Ascochyta and Anthracnose. Stemphylium causes a significant leaf drop, similar to what you may see with Anthracnose, but with Anthracnose, you could look at the lower stems and see if those lesions are there, whereas in the case of Stemphylium, you won't see a lesion on the stem. Thrives under warm and wet conditions. Botrytis, otherwise known as gray mold, can impact almost all parts of the lentil plant, so it could be on stems, leaves, and pods. It's a soil-borne organism that when the environment's right, it seems to develop. Often you'll find it in dense stands in the lower part of the stand in association with Sclerotinia or white mold. Unfortunately, because of where it develops and the plant stand condition at the time it develops, we find control is maybe warranted, but not possible to be implemented in a successful manner. So, as I'd said earlier, Sclerotinia and Botrytis quite often are associated together, and it's because of the environment under that crop canopy. if you choose to use a fungicide to try and keep this in check, for sure you would want to be using that fungicide prior to canopy closure, and you would change the fungicide accordingly. We find this sometimes that the second application is targeted at not only anthracnose but also trying to protect from these two molds at the same time. So in some cases it may be the second application that would be warranted. I'll switch quickly here to chickpea. Ascochyta and chickpea is a very aggressive disease. It's residue borne, but the ascospores can be spread large distances early in the spring. So even though we have rotation recommendations, what happens in the adjacent field is almost as important. It's easily spread by physical activity in the field. I know we've had growers concerned about, the sprayer tracks, they see more Ascochyta development along them. Even field scouting itself, this is one disease where we probably want to pay a little more attention to biosecurity. Again, rain splash is critical to the spore movement and infection. The infection will occur within about 24 hours of a rain event. And you could see visual symptoms within 4 to 6 days. The early symptoms are tan to white spots, the size of a pin on leaflets and stems. Next, so here's an example of infected leaves. Yep, go to the picture. So here's an example of the infected leaves showing, you probably can't see the really small brown dots on there, but these leaves have a number of small brown dots. That in some cases what's happened there is the genetic resistance in the plant has actually kind of stopped that. But then the bigger lesions, much like the one in lentil, you're going to see pycnidia in the middle, a dark margin. There is genetic resistance in chickpea, but as the plants get more mature, they're less resistant. So this is one disease where, fungicide is definitely needed to, help them along. So scouting and application of fungicides on chickpeas is probably a little different than the other pulses. We would recommend to start scouting as early as the seedling stage. The first application of fungicide probably would be recommended in the 7 to 10 node stage, which is prior to flowering occurring. And it's kind of a preventative just to try and keep these plants healthy a little bit longer. Again, continue to scout regularly. Be prepared for, having to need to apply a fungicide every 10 to 14 days if weather is good. And as indicated earlier, for the infection to start, we need, 24 hours of wetness after a rain event. Because it's not all that uncommon to have 3, sometimes even more fungicide applications on chickpeas, we want to pay particular attention to fungicide resistance. So strobilurins for a long time have been the kind of go-to fungicide for a lot of these pathogens. We would recommend that they always be tank mixed with some other mode of action because of the number of applications required. And because of the ability of those products to actually carry on or help the plant live a little bit longer and be healthy a little bit longer, we would actually recommend to not use those products as the last application. Chickpeas, a very indeterminate growth habit plant, 120 days maturity is not uncommon. And, that extra fungicide application late in the season can extend that even some more and encourage more growth. So for sure, that's one that, we would say, some planning has to be put into which fungicides you're going to use and when. Because, like say, 3 is probably the norm for a lot of chickpea growers in a normal growing season, and sometimes even more would be required. With that, I think I've pretty much covered off the 3 main pulses, and I'll turn it over to Kim.
All right. Can you advance the slides there, Sherry? Go to the next one. Next slide. Yep, there we go. All right. So the main disease, back up one, please. The main disease in faba beans is chocolate spot or botrytis, and this is what we've been finding to date. It starts with small reddish dots which grow into well-defined blotches with reddish-brown margins and tan centers on the leaves and stems and pods. If conditions are suitable, the lesions will grow and merge, resulting in a blackening or partial defoliation of the plants. There are 2 species of botrytis, with one being the same as that in lentil, that is Botrytis cinerea, but also Botrytis fabae can attack, and we're not sure exactly which ones is causing the biggest problem, because unfortunately we don't really know an awful lot about the diseases when it comes to faba beans right now. And so there's some work going on. Currently there's a pathologist that is looking at identifying which pathogen is most problematic or impacting yield. But besides understanding that, we need to also look at, and there are research projects that are looking at when they infect the plants and the impact on quality and yield, as well as the timing of fungicide applications. So these are things that we know a little bit about them right now, but we need to know an awful lot more before we can make specific recommendations. Next slide, please. Ascochyta blight is a seed-borne or residue-borne disease of faba beans in Western Canada. Ascochyta leaf or pod spot is caused by Ascochyta fabae, and it's not the same Ascochyta species which infects other pulses. It is specific to faba beans. Lesions do appear on the, as tan or gray spots with dark margins, and tiny black fruiting bodies known as pycnidia are in the center of those, and if you get out a magnifying glass, you can usually see them. Cool and rainy weather conditions are conducive for the spread and infection of the disease, and it's most damaging to maturing pods and seeds if prolonged wet weather occurs during July and August. It is quite often identified when samples are sent to confirm for chocolate spot, so it's something to be aware of, but exactly how much damage is being done by Ascochyta, we're not sure yet. Next slide, please. Next slide. Alternaria leaf spot is caused by the fungal pathogen Alternaria alternata. It is basically dark brown leaf spots which often have a zone pattern or concentric brown rings within dark margins. This is generally a minor disease of faba beans occurring late in the season and is often confused with chocolate spot. So control of Alternaria is not usually warranted. So it's kind of important to make sure that you get a proper diagnosis and don't misdiagnose as botrytis, because you may be spraying a fungicide for something that is not causing an awful lot of damage. Next slide, please. Sclerotinia stem rot. Sclerotinia is basically a common in all broadleaf crops, as mentioned earlier, in Western Canada. But so far, there hasn't been much of a problem noted in faba beans. This disease usually appears, if at all, late in the season with minimal impact on yield. Next slide. Other faba bean diseases that you might see out there would be seed rots or seedling blights, damping off, or root rots, and these are caused by species of Rhizoctonia, Pythium, Fusarium, and Botrytis. Pathogens are present in all Saskatchewan soils and can infect or kill individual seedlings from germination to early flowering stage. Symptoms may include poor germination, root decay, root lesions, stunting, yellowing, and death of the roots. There's really not much we can do for in-crop control of these right now. Crop rotation was thought to be the best method of fighting these diseases. However, it may have a limited effect in managing seedling blight and root rot since it's contained in all Saskatchewan soils. So if you combine disease-free seed with the use of a seed treatment as well as crop rotation, it may be the best way to battle these diseases. Next slide. Other diseases include things like rusts. Rust can be highly destructive in other countries, but it's rarely seen in Canada to date. The disease relies on humidity and is generally spread by late season irrigation. So unless you're under irrigation, it's probably not going to be one of the major diseases that you see in your crop. Anthracnose is in faba beans is the same species which causes anthracnose in lentils and field pea. Crop rotation is probably going to be the key to preventing this disease, as it allows time for the faba beans to residue to decompose and break the disease cycle. Using seeds with low levels of disease, as well as the use of the seed treatment again to protect for anthracnose, to protect the seeds and seedlings from anthracnose is probably your best form of control. Although there are fungicides registered for control of anthracnose. Bean yellow mosaic virus is another disease that is that other pulse crops are susceptible to, as well as faba beans. To avoid bean yellow mosaic virus, you want to avoid planting faba beans in close proximity to established fields of forage legumes and possibly other legumes. Stemphylium blight in faba beans, it is considered a fairly minor disease, and its impact on yield is not really known yet. So there's really no fungicides registered for control of it, but it is suggested that likely a fungicide for applications in other cases of diseases will assist in the control of Stemphylium blight, as John mentioned with lentils. So a similar case here. Powdery mildew. It tends to show up very late in the season on faba beans, and sometimes only on individual plants, and it's generally not considered to be a problem in disease in faba beans. Next slide, please. So scouting tips, basically the same as for other pulses, really at the vegetative state, but since we don't know as much about diseases in faba beans, then you kind of need to start scouting as soon as they come out of the ground or as soon as they start germinating, because we're not sure exactly which diseases are going to be causing problems yet. And if it's Sclerotinia that happens to be causing the problem in any particular field, then it may be actually too late for control once we observe the disease. So if we know that that's going to be an issue, which it hasn't been to date, but if we think it might, then you want to be applying fungicides earlier than that. Next slide, please. We have to also make sure that we're looking at disease and not something else. So leaf burn is not necessarily chocolate spot. We have to make sure that it is actually disease on the leaves and not damage from herbicide application. So herbicide applications can cause some damage to the leaves or sensitive parts of the young leaves, and it's usually on the lower parts of the plant, and the upper areas tend to be more healthy, and it can be caused in situations where herbicides are sprayed at high temperatures. Not sure all of all of the implications of this, but as far as it's being diseased, it's not. And so it's critical to know this so that you're not, again, spraying a fungicide where it's not warranted. Next slide, please. There was a faba bean disease survey conducted in 2016, and of the 18 fields surveyed, 2 fields had trace amounts of disease in the lower canopy, 5 fields had low disease severity in the middle of the canopy, and 11 fields had more severe disease in the upper canopy. Only 4 fields had severity ratings higher than 3 or 22%, and these were in the RMs of 427 and 340. Botrytis was found in 16 of the 18 samples, 5 to 100% incidence, indicating that, as I said, this is probably the most significant disease of faba beans right now. Stemphylium was found in 12 of the 18 samples measured, but as I mentioned before, it's really not considered a major disease, more of a minor disease, so that's probably not going to be too much of a problem. But this survey is going to be continuing in 2017, and they're going to be evaluating Ascochyta and Alternaria as well as the chocolate spot. Next slide, please. In this picture, there is a demonstration here of how effective fungicides can be under heavy disease pressure. This picture was taken just north of Tisdale here. And while we're not sure exactly what the thresholds are or the timing of application for fungicide, a producer left some strips in his field just to determine whether or not he was getting much of a benefit from the fungicide. And I think you can see by the picture that there was significant benefits in this particular field, and it did have a difference on yield. I'm not sure exactly what the yield differences were, but definitely did have some differences. Next slide, please. So the effect of fungicide on timing is being examined in a research project at the U of S that is being conducted by Jessica Pratchler, and she's also continuing this research on basically the research that was done in 2015 and 2016 looked at 2 application timings. So we had a total of 10 site years at 5 locations in the 2 years, which basically adds up to the 10 site years that she looked at. And there were 2 sites that showed definite benefits to applying fungicides. Now, the 2 application timings were early application was at the 10% flowering, which is generally what is recommended on the label, but maybe too early for some applications. And then the late timing was at 50% flowering, which is really, unfortunately, only a few days later, so may not have been late enough for things like the disease that happened at the Melfort site last year, where they saw disease, but it was much later onset and didn't really show up much in yield. So further research looking at the later applications of fungicide is definitely warranted. There are later applications may mean less effect on yield, but quality could definitely still be impacted. Nope, back to this. I'm not finished with the other slide yet. There's a similar trial was done on the SSNS1 tannin variety, and there was less seed staining with this variety, which may have suggested that there is a varietal effect or a tannins effect on the tolerance of the disease. And this is another thing that may need some research in the future. So the research is kind of showing that application timing is not well defined. Praxer at the late timing and Propulse at the late timing definitely showed that there was some benefit to having these fungicides on here. They gave basically a 10 and an 8 bushel yield increase respectively, and it wasn't shown. This wasn't shown on the Melfort site, but many timings have suggested that that these things can be extrapolated from other pulses like lentils, and this may not totally be the case. For example, the application timing on the Praxer is suggested at the beginning of flower, but this was too late for any of the disease that was on the Malford crops, and even too late for the Scott and Outlook research sites that the 50% bloom stage had a better result. So we need to look at timings based on disease development rather than physiological stage. Right now, producers, and I've heard them quote this, they're looking at timings of 10 to 25% leaf infected. This is kind of anecdotal at this point, and we don't know for sure if this is going to be the best timing for it, but right now this is kind of the best guess that they have. Next slide, please. There are a number of fungicides that are registered, of course, for control of various diseases in faba beans, and this particular table is available on the SPG website, so I won't talk about each one individually. Kind of the things to note, I guess, from this slide was that there's only a couple of actual fungicides that are registered for control of chocolate spot, which is our worst disease here. And actually, Vertizan is no longer being produced, so now we're actually kind of down to one. There are a number of these fungicides that are registered for control of similar species of diseases in other crops, so there may be some benefit to them, and this leaves room for possibly some minor use work, and I know that there is some going on right now. For example, Lance, while it's not registered for control of botrytis in faba beans, it is in other crops, so there may be a potential for that to be used in that crop. Headline, for example, is only registered for control of Ascochyta blight and powdery mildew, but it is also registered for control of Anthracnose or the same species of Anthracnose in dry beans, so there may be some benefits to that as well. Right now, we can't make any recommendations based on that because we don't have the minor use work. So I thought that I would just mention it, and hopefully there'll be some new registrations, or at least some minor use registrations that will benefit producers of faba beans in the next little while. Next slide, please. So the final thing that I have was a final comment on the application timings. I guess each of the products have recommended timings depending on the disease target. They may range from the early flower to the first signs of disease. Most products are suggested that they may need a second application, usually 7 to 14 days later, depending on the product, of course, and you have to read the label in order to determine which ones would be best and what the recommendations are for it. But as we've seen here, the research is showing that we need better ways to define this, and hopefully there'll be some research in the near future that will control it, or give better timings for control. And if we're going to target Ascochyta and Sclerotinia at any point, then our application timings are going to need to be before the disease develops. And that's pretty much all I have on faba beans. So I think we're finished, and I think we can take any questions that you have.
Great, thank you very much. And to those who have joined us, thank you for joining our third webinar in the Pulse webinar series for 2017. As Kim mentioned, we will now open up discussion and answer questions that have come in. So if you have questions and you have not already submitted them, please type your question into the question box in the GoToWebinar dashboard so that we can make sure we can ask any of the questions that you might have. Kim, John, and Sherry, there are just a few questions that have come in so far. I will, the first one probably to you, Sherry, is around brown spot in soybeans, and should we be spraying, and if so, what would you recommend there?
Generally in brown spot in soybeans, the severity is not economically viable to the point where you need to spray. If the disease hits really early, you would have to do a count of how many leaves are affected and how far along the plant is, and whether or not you figure that you're going to get a yield reduction. But as of right now, they're recommending no, there's no need to spray. It's basically more of a cosmetic type infection at this point that's not really causing any extreme yield losses. So as such, I'm never an advocate of anything unless there's an economic benefit to doing it. So at this point, no.
Thank you. And then also you mentioned that we've seen white mold in the past, and if we were going to look at a fungicide for managing that disease in soybeans, what is the best timing that you would look at for a fungicide application?
If I knew for sure that white mold had been a problem in the field before, like say the year before we had it in our canola, and because of the way our rotations were set up, we had to put the beans in that field. They are coming up with some real decent sound studies and research putting contans down. Now, contans is a biological fungicide application. It needs to be put down the fall before you would plant the beans. There's been a lot of work done up in the Outlook Lumsden area where they are showing that it is effective. Otherwise, I'm not one to necessarily recommend any specific product. I would say go to your, put out your 2017 crop protection guide and pull it out and look to see what we've got listed for fungicides out there. There's quite a few of them now that are on the market that can give you some control on some of these things. Timing is the big thing. You need to scout. Like I said, do you know that the environment's existing? We want the warmth and we want wet. Do you know that the Sclerotinia is in the area from previous problems that have happened with other crops that have been in the area? Sclerotinia, they're now finding can move up to 100 meters. It can be moved by water, by soil, and also by air. So it is something that can be moved from one field to another. And start thinking that you want to time before the disease starts to become a big issue. So that's where the scouting comes into effect. If you start walking the field and starting to see the little white powder, the problem is it's a systemic type disease. So once some of the symptoms are there, you can bring down the level of disease, but you can't get rid of it like some other type of diseases where if you spray, it'll be gone. You can suppress it, but look for the environments that are conducive to creating it in the first place, and think about, depending on your yield goals that you have, think about doing some preventative spraying beforehand.
Sounds good. Thank you. John, perhaps a question for you. How common is bacterial blight in field pea?
Bacterial blight in field pea is one that we really haven't seen much of. I can't recall in the surveys we've done where we've ever acknowledged it as being something that's present. It's maybe something we have to watch more in the future, but at this point, I'm not aware of being worried about it at all. So.
Okay, and also, at what stage would you start scouting for Stemphylium blight in lentils, or when would symptoms first start to show up, those tan lesions on the leaves? At what stage do you think?
They're going to show up pretty much at the same time as you're going to be looking at for Anthracnose and Ascochyta. So the early flower, you may start to see some, the smaller lesions on the leaves at that point in time. Quite often it's usually mid to late flower before guys realize it's really there, and what it's already got to the point where they've got a tan color to the canopy and some leaf drop. But you should be able to find symptoms in that early flowering stage as well.
Okay, thank you. And Kim, a question for you. Are Faba beans susceptible to Fusarium root rot like we've seen in other pulses?
Yes, from my research, I believe they are. I haven't seen it, and Faba beans tend to be more of a water-loving crop, and I haven't seen it in any of the fields that I've surveyed. But yes, they are susceptible to it. Okay,
and is there anything in particular we can do to manage root rots in pulses?
Really, it's going to kind of come down to I think sourcing disease-free seed, maintaining rotations no more than 1 in 4 years, as well as using that in a combination with seed treatments.
Thank you, Kim. That's all of the questions that we have in so far. If you do have other questions and you want to send them into myself or contact your regional crop specialist directly, that would be fine. Just a reminder for those who are looking for CCAs that the CCA and CCS credits will be available, and Andrea will be sending out an email following this webinar to request your CCA or CCSC numbers. Also a reminder that the webinar has been recorded and it will be posted to the SPG website, and you will be able to find it under the communications tab on the website. At that time, you can also provide suggestions for future webinars. We always appreciate feedback and suggestions, so if Andrea emails you and you want to provide some feedback, please send that back to her. And thank you so much, Sherry, John, and Kim, for speaking to us today on scouting for pulse diseases. You did a great job, and I think it would have been very useful information to all of those who were on the webinar today. As well, thank you to Andrea for organizing today's session, and a really big thank you to all of the participants who took time out of their day to join us for this webinar. And finally, please mark your calendars for our next webinar, which will take place at noon on October 13th, covering grading your pulses. And you can sign up for this webinar, as you have for the other webinars, from the SPG website under the News and Events tab. And with that, thank you very much, and have a great day, everyone.